Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Joseph Edwards, Chief Science Officer of Yofumo Technologies. Thank you very much for joining me today, Joseph.
Happy to be here. Thank you, David.
Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Joseph, I always like to start the podcast with a little bit of background. So, how was it that you found yourself working in cannabis?
Oh, man. So that's actually a fun story. So originally from Ohio many, many years ago, and the onset of Colorado's cannabis industry about 2009, kind of had that aha moment. Cannabis had always been a part of my life in one way or another, deeply kind of attached to the agricultural industries, growing up in a rural farming community, growing up on smaller farms, looking at soil analysis, looking at field analysis, crop analysis, and kind of having come from a deep background in that from both a family and an education perspective, I kind of really saw that new industry, kind of that cannabis as that burgeoning industry really coming online, and wanted to be part of that first wave and kind of putting that personal history and that passion together. And it's been a wild ride since then.
You know, one thing that I've always found, because I grew up on a small farm myself, is that it really gives you a work ethic that sticks with you throughout the rest of your life. I mean, do you feel the same?
Oh, absolutely. Although I'll be the first to say I'm probably nowhere near the work ethic of my father. A lot of the individuals still doing it. One of the things I was eager to do as fast as I could was get off that farm as far away as I possibly could. It's kind of odd that I've traveled around the world and been here and there, and well, I'm still a farmer.
No, I completely agree with you, where you're just like, oh man, I don't ever want to do this again. But then when you start doing other stuff, you're like, man, this is a breeze.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. Kind of that early farm life. There was definitely some moments there. Picking rocks, tending fields, all of the labor kind of portions of it that, man, I don't think anybody really enjoys. But having kind of come full circle to the other side of it, the data analysis, the crop analysis, and really looking at breeding platforms, decontamination methodologies, biosynthesis through curing, really kind of brought it all back around. You kind of really see that kind of ground up or roots up approach.
So how did you find yourself working with Yofumo?
I was originally working with a couple large operators in Colorado, had some great success, worked with some wonderful, wonderful teams out here, and was working primarily in the post-harvest landscape. And one of the things I was really focused on was curation, biosynthesis. And kind of as we really started to look at cultivation technologies, there was a lot of work being put into those upstream platforms, those pre-harvest phases, going from HVAC units that were designed from server farms that were great at dissipating heat but horrible at moisture, to lighting systems designed for the cut flower industry that weren't really the right spectrum for cannabis, didn't really have the proper depth of penetration for the canopy, and seeing those really develop and technology really being put into those sectors. But then we got into the post-harvest space, and we're going back to archaic methodologies that haven't been used outside of textbooks or third world countries in a very long time, in some cases hundreds of years. Going from these climate-controlled, highly climatized, purpose-built environments to a closet with a Home Depot dehumidifier, and kind of seeing that as a big opportunity of what could be. Yofumo also kind of having a similar idea from the decontamination end. Started talking with the guys there, really liked what they were doing, and started working them to develop the IP, and just found a really good fit. And man, that's been almost 10 years ago.
So, I mean, did you see that as a symptom of a nascent industry that just wasn't mature yet when you were looking at where it was when it came to post-harvest processing?
To a degree. From a regulatory standpoint, there was still a lot of work to be done. I'll reference Colorado again. The medical and rec codexes were completely separate documents for a very long time. We had testing of recreational product, not testing of medical product. We had a lot of changes year to year, even updates and addendums throughout the year of what we were testing for, how we were going to test, what methodologies we were going to use, how we we're going to perform, and when. But as far as kind of a need for the industry, there's always been a curation function to cannabis. And I think that really bringing it from, the garage, the basement, the backyard into industrialized farming practices, some of that got left behind. Um, Kind of the dark art, so to speak, of cannabis, but still very much a science-driven function. And I think that in the effort to cultivate as much cannabis, to grow as big as we could, to chase those new genetics, to chase those new profiles, to chase that high cannabinoid count, some things got left behind initially. Not that they weren't important, not that there wasn't a mind to them, but it just wasn't really the first item on a lot of people's plates when it came to production. Now we see a more developed industry now, 10, 15 years down the road in some states, where we're now really looking at the quality of cannabis, that end user focus. Terpenes, for example, were an unknown word. Now they're a consumer hot button.
Did you find yourself initially more drawn towards the dark art side of the industry, or have you always been drawn to sort of the science?
It's always good for me. It's been the science. There was that obviously kind of an appeal to that dark art side, and how can we do it? How can we change it? How can we manipulate it? But in order to understand that, we really have to understand what's happening from a chemical reaction level, from a biosynthesis level, what the plant is doing, how can we manipulate that process, how can we foster that chemical reaction to its highest degree of efficacy? Where do we start? Where do we stop it? How do we control it? And those were kind of really the questions that drove me towards the curation side. And then when we started looking at that, and this is one of the things that was a great synergy when I joined Alter Fumo many years ago, was that they were very focused on decontamination, having a stable product, both from an active water perspective as well as a bioburden perspective. And then once we have that stable product, once we have that kind of clean canvas to work with, what can we do with it from there? Kind of that idea being really focused around, there's really no meaning to putting the effort in, and we can never bring it to market. How do we guarantee it comes to market? Well, we guarantee that it's clean.
So how do we guarantee that it can come to market, and can we guarantee that it's clean?
There are a myriad of ways. There's ozone-based technologies, there's radiation-based technologies, there's ionic RF technologies. There's many means to kind of shear the sheep, so to speak. They all have their pros and cons. They all have different methodologies. But essentially what we're doing is we're looking at remediating bioburden, yeasts, molds, bacteria, enzymatic life, fungal compounds, viral compounds, advanced microbial life, such as aspergillus, coliform, pseudomonas viridans. All of these things that are a mainstay and everyday factor of agrarian production, be it fruits, vegetables, seeds, or other, has really kind of become a main part of cannabis as well. It's another consumer commodity. It's another agrarian product. So that was very much in line with a lot of the original kind of childhood background that I'd had growing up again on farms.
So you said that every technology has its pros and cons. Where does Yofumo fit in?
So we're obviously a decontamination technology. We have a very unique approach to how we generate our decontamination function. Whereas a lot of traditional based ozone companies use a process called atmospheric deprivation. This is pumping enough ozone into a confined space that we kill everything across the aerobic spectrum. The spectrum needs oxygen to live. And this is good for a lot of yeast, molds, some funguses. It does tend to fall short on some advanced bacteria, more developed microorganisms. It can be great for a lot of applications, but for cannabis specifically, it kind of fell short to what we were really looking to achieve. When you look at ozone as a chemical compound, as a molecular compound, it's a free radical oxidizer. It doesn't care what it interacts with. It's completely non-discriminate. The level of which of ozone, the concentration of ozone, is really what controls that. Traditional methodologies for generating ozone were kind of limited to ozone pumps, which can convert about 21.6% of atmospheric oxygen at a given time. You can manipulate that number up and down a little bit depending on the purity of the feedstock, the quality of the air, the power of the pump that you're using, the electrolysis that it's using to actually stimulate and disrupt ionic and atmospheric oxygen. But what it doesn't allow you to do is control the degree of ozone that you're creating. It's on or it's off. It's binary. You can't really control the speed of the car, so to speak. So we really liked the ease of ozone. We really liked its availability from both a price point as well as a usability standpoint, not requiring a lot of heavy tools, not requiring specialization or highly skilled technical staff. But what we didn't like was what it did to the plant. Yes, did it kill some of these fungal microbial compounds? Absolutely. But it's also damaging what we call VOCs, volatile organic compounds. These are cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids. the valuable parts of cannabis, the reason that we're producing it in the first place, and what our consumers, be they medical patients or recreational, really are striving to find. So we started taking a look at other technologies, started looking at radiation. There's been a plethora of various radiation solutions over the years. They've been present in the greater ag industry for many years prior to cannabis, and they also have kind of their great range. Now, radiation technologies, super effective across nearly the entire spectrum of viral, fungal, organic compounds, you name it. It'll most certainly kill it. But what else is it doing? We found that as we kind of dug deeper into that technology, what we were seeing was some destabilization again in those VOCs. We were seeing some destabilization in the genetic makeup of those viral fungal compounds, those developed microorganisms, where they were becoming cultural non-viable, which means they're no longer functioning, but they're not destroyed. And that became an issue for us as we started looking at what are the analytical methodologies here? What are the labs using? The labs are using principally two main methodologies, either PCRI/PCRQ thermal cycling analysis, which is DNA replication. We're spinning it up as many times as we can. We're stretching it out, and we're seeing if we can see this occurrence. We're seeing if we can develop whatever the contaminant we're targeting is. And then plate-based methodologies. This is the old school way that we all probably learned in science class at one point in time of taking a 3M medium plate, an agar plate, putting bacteria on it, incubating it in a lab oven, and seeing what grows. And then looking at it through a microscope, looking at what's growing, identifying it, determining what the average or estimated colony forming units or CFUs per gram are. Okay, this is great. But how can we really marry these two technologies? Again, not really liking what either one did to the plant, really liking that pervasiveness of effectiveness through radiation, really liking that ease of availability through ozone. Is there a way we can marry these functions? So we started looking at is what do we actually do to the cellular structure of these contaminants, of this bioburden? And what we found is that we can utilize ozone to interact with them without damaging the plant cellular structure. But here's the key. We had to be able to control the ozone. So we partnered with a company called Atlantic Ultraviolet many years ago, went through, oh man, little more than a half decade of material science research, finding out exactly how we could do it. And what we found was that UVC elements vibrate. And as they vibrate, they can produce ozone. And that vibration, anywhere between the 183 and 277 nanometer spectrum, accomplishes this fairly well. There's varying degrees of stability through that spectrum. We ended up identifying about 185 nanometers, give or take a few decimal points there, where we found that that's really that stable production point for us, the elements we were using. And with that element produced, now we had a means of which to control that exact gram per minute per cubic foot production of ozone within our system. So then we went into about another half decade of analytical testing. All right, let's look at every possible contaminant that is currently being tested for, may be tested for. Let's take the scope outside of cannabis. Let's look at foods. Let's look at European requirements. Let's look at Central and South American requirements. Let's look at North American requirements. Okay. And as we began looking at that, we found that we were able to interact with those bioburden, those mycological compounds at a level of ozone that was far below the level of which it starts damaging plant cellular structure, starts damaging those VOCs. And from there, it's been go to market.
So taking the best of both worlds, is it all pro, or does your method have some cons as well?
It's not all pro. The con to our methodology is it's more time intensive than some other ones. It's far less intrusive. It's nearly completely non-damaging to the plant. As part of some of our EU GMP validations, we've run up to 96 hours of exposure time, seeing no detriment. But it's more time intensive. Because we're using these low concentrations, we're not necessarily hitting things with a jackhammer. We're treating things very tactically. And yeah, you can absolutely kind of create a blanket protocol that applies to a whole facility, a whole cultivar, a whole cultivation room, or you can treat specifically to a COA, a certificate of analysis. So we really wanted to give the client the ability to use that tool in any way, shape, or form. A hammer is only good if you need to hammer a nail, but what else can it be used for? Well, there's a lot of things, and it's up to really the client, the user, to figure out how best to use that tool. So we want to make it as broad for them as possible, One of the things that we also found though was as part of our approach, yes, it's more timely, but there were certain things that the timely approach allowed us to interact with better. Aspergillus compounds are a great example here. They have the ability of what's called metabolic inertness. So if they don't have an environment conducive to their growth and development, they'll go into a state of essentially, I refer to as a fortress mode. It turtles. It becomes very hard to remove. It's a defense mechanism on a natural cellular level. So when you expose compounds like aspergillus to high amounts of ozone, it triggers this metabolic inertness. Part of our methodology, and one of the things we kind of found as a side effect of that long exposure time with those low concentrations, is that we were able to avoid triggering that natural response. And that's kind of what allowed us to open the door to some of those more developed microbial compounds that are a plight to some portions of the industry. Oregon specifically has a large problem with aspergillus and gram-negative biotolerant bacteria based on some traditional cultivation methodologies that are prevalent in the state. Living soil operations specifically, which tend to build up contaminations within the soil bed, specifically around gram-negative biotolerant bacteria. You do get some natural heavy metal occurrence. Arsenic occurs naturally in soil. I know it's a really scary word to hear, but it's a very natural thing from a farming or industrial farming practice, and there's ways to mitigate it provided that you're looking at it correctly. And while there's nothing we can do about the heavy metal content, we wanted to make sure they were able to interact with that full spectrum of microbes.
So after 10 years in development, how has the market responded to your solution?
Fairly well. We're unknown, and that's almost entirely my fault. I seized our entire budget for far longer than I think any of our partners would have liked, and threw it all into research. So our marketing is woefully behind our tech, but we're happy to be able to present what we feel is a very robust piece of technology into the market. We've got a fairly established client base through South Africa, Central America, the US, Western Europe. So kind of doing well, taking off. One of the side effects, though, is we were a little late to the game. Companies like RadSource, companies like Willow, companies like Zeal kind of already had a foothold there. And because of some of the disadvantages to the use of some of those technologies, there's a bit of an industry disposition against ozone-based tech or even decontamination in general. There's a lot of movements for non-remediated, never remediated product. And it's absolutely possible to grow clean cannabis. It is. I did it for years and years and years. Many operators do it every single day. But the concept of producing ad infinitum without having a failure event, while possible, scientifically improbable. It's still a people-driven industry. People are often the dirtiest things in a grow. But we've really seen kind of the industry move through several phases. Those Gen 1, Gen 2 cultivations that were built in that '09 through 2015-ish era on the West Coast through Washington, through Oregon, through Colorado, California. And we see a lot of wood construction. We see a lot of retrofitted older buildings, be they warehouses, mechanic shops, anything that was zone light industrial that had the ability to be leased and revamped. A lot of those buildings came with a lot of sins that existed in them that people had to work around, develop against. There wasn't really a lot of thought towards the future. There was a lot of thought toward, oh man, they're letting us grow cannabis. Let's do this. Let's pump it through. And like any industry, it slowly developed. It learned from its lessons. It stumbled, it fell, but it got right back up and overcame those hurdles. So now we see these purpose-built environments, these climate-controlled environments being fully vinyl or fully poly. We see sealed floors. We see non-porous, high-density polyethylene materials. We see 316L stainless steel, which is pharma-grade compliant, versus where we used to see wood construction. We used to see plastic netting. We used to see cloth trellising. All kinds of things that, while very much deeply steeped in agrarian practices, don't really lend themselves well to microbial stability or biosecurity. The same thing with people. It's people kind of coming in from outside as you would in any job or any factory production job. We don't really see that so much anymore as if people just kind of coming in off the street in their regular civilian clothes. Now we see employees gowning. Now we see purpose-built garments, shoes that stay inside the building. All of these little tiny steps that don't sound like very much, but when you combine them, when you aggregate them, really contribute deeply to a facility's health.
What are your thoughts on those controversies that you run into when it comes to decontamination and using ozone? Is it just every time, is it same spiel, or do you think that the industry is becoming better educated into dispelling some of those myths?
Yes to both. There is a bit of rote to it. It is in some ways the same conversation over and over again, but when you start to look at it as education and not just regurgitation, it really kind of takes that edge off of it. You know, be they producer, be they cultivator, be they consumer, or be they just someone curious about the industry, kind of bring that education, fostering that education has really always been a personal goal of mine, as well as one of Yofumos, as it is with many operators within the cannabis community. And kind of one of those things to understand. And there's always been the argument of, well, isn't there something else we could do with it? Does it have to be clean? Does it have to be decontaminated? Why wasn't it clean in the first place? What's the threshold of which we say, hey, this is too dirty to clean, or hey, this is possible? Those are all conversations that are going to be unique to the operator, be unique to the environment. Can you move the product downstream? Can you extract it, create ancillary products, be it an extract or an edible or other? Yeah, absolutely. But what if you've already allocated all the product necessary to that? Or what if you don't need 60 pounds of cultivar X? Okay, well, we had to be able to bring that to market. And each one of those ancillary steps, each one of those refined products also has an increased labor coefficient, also has an increased cost coefficient. So now we're shrinking the margins. And as the cannabis industry has become more competitive and more widespread, we've really seen a shrinking of the margins nationwide. The consumers are becoming more demanding. Cannabis is becoming easier to produce in higher volumes, but at the same time, again, those margins are shrinking. So the desire to bring clean, high quality cannabis is more prevalent than any other time.
I wanted to talk about the Michigan case study that you provided prior to our interview. Can you describe exactly what happened with that particular client and how you fixed it?
Absolutely. So that was a really unique case scenario. They reached out to us a few years back now. It was right before Christmas. I actually ended up flying to Detroit to help them. The family was none too pleased, but hey, it's the job. They had just gone through a massive renovation of their facility. As part of that renovation, they did an EPA check on the building, and they thought everything was fine. What ended up actually being the case was there was some lacking elements to the construction. Some things weren't sealed right. There were some gaps in the ceiling. There was some moisture leakage. There was some inefficiencies in the air handling systems, and it really backed up on them. Cannabis, like any other crop, has its own susceptibilities. And one of those susceptibilities is when we hit certain temperature variables, when we hit certain humidity thresholds, we really start to see that propensity for microbiological life to develop. When we see airflow drop past a certain point, we again see another potential spike here. And right after they had finished this massive reconstruction, to be hit with kind of these plights and woes from a microbial standpoint, they really didn't know what to do. So they were suffering from 1 million plus CFUs of combined yeast, mold, and bacteria. They had 3 of the 4 known aspergillus variants that we test for in cannabis, some cases simultaneously. And they had no choice but to bring this crop to market or shutter the business. So we were able to come in over the course of about a week. We brought the machine in. I did a full analysis of their facility. We went back, we looked at their lab reports. I worked with their lab director at that time and the lab that they were using, and kind of really started to look at, okay, can we pinpoint it to a cultivar susceptibility? Can we pinpoint it to a room? Can we possibly trace down the source of this contamination? What's patient zero, so to speak? Where's the hot spot? And what we found was there wasn't just one, as there often isn't. There was many. It was incredibly prevalent. So over the course of about a week, as we were utilizing the technology to clean up their product, we slowly worked with them to kind of patch those holes in the operation. Okay, here's what we can do to help alleviate this. Okay, here's what we can do to alleviate this in the meantime. This is going to be a longer project. We need to start it here, but here are the steps we can take for now. And that's kind of always been our approach: is one, hands-on, but two, kind of very client-driven. We've never been in the business, and I've always supported this deeply, of kind of giving you the keys and sending you down the road in the car. We'd like to be our continual resource. This is our expertise, this is our knowledge, and it generally makes me feel good when I get to come in and solve somebody's problem. Not to mention that you get to see some cool operations. You get to see a lot of varying methodologies. And as someone who's been in the industry for a very long time, very passionate about it, and worked across the entire spectrum of the industry, it's always cool to see what those niche technological developments are for those individual methodologies, for the individual practices. Hey, you have an equipment set in combination that I've never seen used before in like this particular configuration. How's it working for you? What are you seeing? And kind of getting to peek under the hood has been a real, at least for me, a real treat.
Do you think, does that consultative approach, is that a differentiator for Yofumo? I mean, rather than just selling a piece of equipment, you also provide an opportunity to make long-term fixes?
I would say yes, but I wouldn't call it necessarily differential. You see a lot of operators, especially in the post-harvest space or the equipment providing space now within the cannabis industry, kind of really leaning towards that. Initially, not so. I remember many years ago trying to get in touch with my Hortilux representative, who didn't really want to get on the phone if I wasn't ordering more bulbs. Now they're happy to come in. They're happy to bring a par meter. They're happy to check light spectrum. They're happy to kind of go through those things. Yes, does it give them ability to upsell or possibly change out a product? Absolutely. But that direct customer service has now become even more important because they're not the only name in the game. At one point in time, they were.
In your opinion, does the industry have a problem with contamination, or does it have more of a problem with how contamination is regulated?
I would say it has more of a problem with how contamination is regulated. There's no such thing as an agrarian crop that doesn't have some form of contamination. Again, people being the dirtiest thing. I promise you, if we take a swab analysis of your desk right now, we'll find some probably horrifying things.
Just
As,
filthy.
as we will with almost anything. The cannabis industry is held to a bit stricter of a standard, as it should be in some regards. When we look at cannabis as a medicinal product, as an API, as an active pharmaceutical ingredient, if we start speaking about it as medicine, then yes, we absolutely have to hold to a tighter, more stringent standard. Some of the things that we test for, aspergillus again popping up here, and some of the molds we test for are pathogenic. They have a notable negative impact on the human condition. They should absolutely not be something present on cannabis being consumed, nor anything else for that matter. But how that regulation is shaped is, I think, really what the industry needs to focus on next, at least from that particular facet. We see a myriad of different requirements throughout state to state, ranging from the microbes they test for to the means of which they test, how they test, when they test, and kind of how long that compliance testing can range. For example, New York's original testing requirements were so restrictive that the idea of any producer ever managing to sell a single grain of cannabis that checked every box was horrifying. Like, uh, I can't imagine operators when they saw that first kind of look at the list. Now that list has been revised, it's been chopped down. Some of the things have taken off, and there's some things on there that just really don't apply to cannabis. But New York, kind of being new to that operation, kind of it taking foothold there, they applied what their food industry standards were. And while a good place to start, not necessarily an applicable analog. We can take a look at the other side of the country now. We'll take a look at Oregon again, actually. Oregon put in place microbial testing regulations that nearly shut down its industry because of the methodologies that people were using. Again, that living soil methodology. And while there should never be an occurrence of aspergillus in cannabis, regulations also can't cripple the industry that they're regulating. Now we'll kind of take a look in the middle, and I'll actually use the middle of the country as the example here. Chicago, very small production industry, primarily MSOs. They've opened up some more smaller licenses now in the last couple of years, possibly the most stringent cannabis regulations in the US, but they are producing under them, and they're producing under them effectively.
So you have the opportunity to reshape the regulatory landscape. And in this perfect scenario, all the regulators are actually going to do the same thing.
Oh man, we're not unicorns. Okay.
Yeah. How do you reshape the industry in your own eye?
How do we reshape the industry from a decontamination standpoint? Okay. Right off the top of my head, here's what I would say. We have to define a testing methodology that is universal. Doesn't matter if it's plate-based incubation, which I personally don't think it should be. It's a bit of an inaccurate science in that regard. If we utilize something like PCRI or PCRQ technology, we have to determine one functional set of assays so that everybody that's testing is testing against the same control. Once we have that stability in testing, how we're actually, from an analytical standpoint, measuring the quantitative analysis of this bioburden, then we need a unified codex of what do we actually need to analyze. Is it gram-negative biotolerant bacteria? Is it coliforms? Is it yeast and mold? Is it STEC? Is it E. coli? What molds, what funguses, what viruses? The list needs refined down. There's probably some that need to be on there. In fact, there absolutely are. There's some that needed to be defined better other than just general yeast and molds. Once we have that list and an assay that supports it, then we can start looking at things like proenzymatic, probiotic bacteria. There's a lot of really cool farming and production practices that have gone out the window because our testing doesn't delineate between one type of bacteria or another. There's some that's incredibly beneficial to the human body. Yogurt's a great example here, really helps the human biome. And then we have pathogenic yeast and molds that can potentially cause fatal interactions in somebody with an immuno or respiratory deficiency. So that's kind of really where I would shape it to start. A firm basis of how we test, a firm basis of what we test, and knowing why. And I think that once we can establish that, then we can move forward as an industry, both from a consuming perspective as well as a production perspective. Like, this is why we're doing X. The result is Y.
In your opinion, what should be on that list of what we should test for?
Any pathogenic compound that can potentially occur in cannabis needs to be on that list. Absolutely. There are some that are. There's some that aren't. There's some that aren't tracked, in my opinion, correctly. There's some penicillium variants that, while yes, they do fall under that general yeast and more category, I would like to see as delineated and broken out. But kind of here's the other hinge to that. The more rigorous testing becomes, the more costly testing becomes, and the less likely operators are to commit to R&D testing, to continual testing. Those are kind of things that we need to balance as well. When we have a $500 microbial panel test, and we have an industry that's kind of already harvest to harvest, so to speak, it becomes very difficult to convince operators that, hey, we need to do R&D tests, we need to do replicate sampling, we need to do these things so we can establish a firm data set to work forward from, instead of just, hey, let's make sure we pass the test in the cheapest way possible, i.e. only take it once, which is great. But when we look at other producing industries, we get into what's called process validation. How consistent are your practices? How consistent is your end product? And this is very important, again, from that medicinal or API function. When we take aspirin, for example, if you take an aspirin and it takes your headache away, and you take another one and it makes your foot go numb, this is a big problem. So having cannabis that is consistent, produced consistently, tested consistently, and shows a consistent pattern of cleanliness, of lack of bioburden through GACP, through GMP processes, this is really where the industry needs to step to. This is really kind of where we need to go. And we're starting to see this now with the newest generations of cultivation in the US. We're seeing it in a lot of Canadian cultivations, Western European cultivations. We're even seeing it through South America and Africa. I would say the US is a little bit behind in that regard. While we have taken great strides in the distribution of cannabis, because we don't have a federal legalization, we've created all these unique state-by-state microcosms. So a unification of that is kind of really where we need to go. And then from there, we can develop FDA statutes. I mean, if we look at 20 years ago, cannabis being a Schedule I drug on the federal level, there's very little research within the US being put into cannabis. Yeah, there's some universities doing studies, there's some government field studies, but nothing that we would really say is scientific grade, peer reviewed medicinal research. And now we're beginning that, but it's going to take time. FDA statuting takes decades in some cases, but developing that statuting, creating ASTM standard, and then applying that to the US and EU pharmacopoeias, and then really moving forward then on an even scale, where operators know unilaterally what they need to do, why they need to do it, and they have a know-how.
In your opinion, is industry testing improving?
It is. It very much is. Again, we'll bring up PCRI, PCRQ technology, thermocyclers. Yes, these have existed for quite some time, but we're now seeing them come into the cannabis industry, not only from the lab side, but also from the in-house R&D side. Lab-grade equipment, while expensive, has dropped significantly in price. Benchtop models aren't hundreds of thousands of dollars anymore in most cases. For $5, $10, $15,000, you can get a benchtop thermocycler. You can take an online class, and the companies that produce them are happy to train you to do so. They're happy to teach you how to use the tool, because then you have to come by assays, and there is a bit of a continual cost there for them. But being able to bring that in-house, being able to know, take a mock exam, so to speak, before you go to that state required testing, which now tracks permanently into a seed to sale system. These are really things that I think are really developing, while not as fast as I would like, absolutely kind of in line with what you would expect. And they're developing because there's a need, both from the production standpoint, again, to guarantee that we're clean and going to market, as well from the lab side to coincide with that. So being able to utilize the same or similar technologies that your laboratory is using is a great move. Versus, now we will rewind the clock again now to that 09, 2015 era, where all microbial analysis near unilaterally is being done by that plate-based incubation sampling. And there's a lot of inaccuracies or potential inaccuracies with that. When we take that plate, when we put it in the incubation oven, be it for 48, 72, 96 hours, whatever that state requirement may be, and we see what grows, well, we're not really counting all of it. When you see a COA that says, we'll call it 100,000 CFUs of a given yeast mold or bacteria, there's not a lab technician sitting there with a microscope. One, two, three. It's not happening. We would all love it if they did, but it's not time efficient. It's not cost efficient. So what they'll do is they'll take a piece of film and they'll print a random spatial pattern on that film, typically about 10% of the total area, sometimes less, sometimes a little more, and they'll place it over the dish. Now, whatever those random spatial dots on that film are, they'll look under those. They'll count what's under those. And then they'll multiply that by whatever the dividend is, 10 multiplied by 10. So that film may land dead in the middle of a hot spot. It may land dead in the middle of a blank spot. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there, a lot of testing inconsistencies. And this has become prevalent in the industry. We call it lab shopping. Hey, I failed my microbial test at lab A. All right, well, send it over to lab B. Oh, we passed you. And that could be as simple as just where that film fell. So with thermocycling and PCR technology, we take that out the way. It's no longer, oh, it's about 100,000 or it's, about this. No, it's 1,963. We can give you that exact number. We can tell you exactly what it is. Now, there's some variance there on the assays that are being used, be it bioMérieux, be it medicinal genomics. There are dozens of others. But again, a unification of that codex, a unification of that standard is what I really will think help move the industry forward, at least within the realm of contamination and testing.
Do you see lab shopping increasing or decreasing lately?
It's increasing. It's increasing near unilaterally. It's increasing for microbes. It's increasing for potency. It's increasing for terpene analysis. With potency specifically, you have a lot of people, quote unquote, adulterating samples, rolling them in keys, spiking them with other compounds, all for kind of that high dollar value. For a long time, cannabis sales, especially with flower, had been very much potency driven. Oh, it's only 20%. I don't want that. I want the one that's 25. I want the one that's 30. And that's a fairly inaccurate way to go about your purchase of cannabis. A lot of people I know are fond of the moonshine analogy. Just because they sell moonshine at the liquor store doesn't mean anybody really needs 200 proof mineral spirits. No, absolutely not. For cleaning, absolutely. For human consumption, well, it says so on the bottle. Don't do it. But now we're starting to see a more developed consumer. Again, where terpenes were an unknown word, 3-4 years ago. Now they're also helping drive that sales function. And when we look at cannabinoids, we look at terpenes, we look at flavonoids, the means of which we test also comes into this. When we look at potency, what we're often looking at is trichome saturation. And there's a lot of ways, again, to fudge that number. You can add keef, but we're not looking at what the trichome is. When we think about it from a biological level, the trichome's a cup. It's a cup designed to hold very few things: cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, these volatile organic compounds. But what if the cup is empty? And then what's the value of it? So you've got 36 cups, you have 36% cannabinoid content, but the curation process wasn't necessarily done great. And we really haven't moved those volatile organic compounds to that holding vessel, that trichome, effectively. So maybe not all those cups are full, maybe they're half full. And now on the other side, we may have a 20% cannabinoid cultivar, but it's been immaculately cured. It's gone through a wonderful post-harvest regime, and those cups are brimming, they're overfilling. The user will see most of the time a far better experience from that 20% high terpene content that's properly cured than they will for that potency content. Distillate's a great example here. Pure distillate, which is THC soup, it has been stripped of literally everything but the cannabinoid in question. So if we're going through something like a CO2 super subcritical system, and then in through some type of chromatography, be it thin film, fine film, white film, or whatever may have you, what is left is a pure molecular compound, or at least it should be. But it doesn't really do much for you by itself. If you've ever consumed distillate just by itself, yeah, there's an effect, but I really wouldn't call it a desirable one, at least not for me. when we start thinking about cannabinoids and terpenes and the entourage effect in this way, one of the ways I like to explain it to clients is if we consider the cannabinoid as the vehicle, the potency is the velocity, then the destination is highly dependent on the terpene content. This is what neurosynaptic effects are really being triggered here. When we look at, let's say, for example, linolol and terpinolene, these are couch locky strains. These are going to have a much more sedative effect than something, let's say, that's very high in limonene or alpha pinene. We can take the middle of the spectrum and kind of that euphoric effect, high in humulene, high in myrcene. So now really kind of looking at what is one doing for the other. Okay, the cannabinoid is the delivery system. The potency is the velocity, kind of the hit of that delivery. How is it going to deliver? This is this is really highly addicted on the terpene content, and we've done this the entourage effect. And it's a fairly accurate way to express it. But now we're kind of seeing, instead of that high potency shopping, we're really kind of looking at, okay, I want a potency that matches my terpene content. I want that terpene content to really be dictated on the effect I'm looking to achieve. And this is going to be very important as we look at cannabis from a nutraceutical individualized medicine approach.
Do you believe in the entourage effect?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a clear synergy between cannabinoid and terpene and flavonoid content. One without the other does have an effect. All three together have a synergistic effect, and it's a scientifically validated principle.
Should regulations for both the medical and recreational market be the same?
Does the market stand now? Yes, absolutely. And I say that with the mind of, because we're still distributing it in the same way. We're still cultivating it in the same way. The only difference in a lot of operations between medical and recreational is the color of a metric tag, blue or yellow. And that's really about all the differentiating between it from a cultivation standpoint. On the distribution side, on the retail side, yes, we see medical with some higher tolerance limits on edibles or other ancillary products, or maybe a little bit higher of a limit on your ability to purchase with that medical card. But because they're being produced in the exact same way, because they're being distributed in the same way, yes, it needs to be unified. Now, if we start looking at cannabis truly as an API, as an active pharmaceutical ingredient, then there needs to be a different set of regulations, a different codex, and it needs to be far more stringent.
Okay. I wanted to get back into Yofumo's technology. It's the Pro Plus Cure, correct?
Yep, it is indeed.
So how does like when people are looking to bring it in-house, what does installation look like? What does training look like? And does it take anything to maintain?
So great questions. We are very, very proud that we have what we call a plug-and-play solution. The crate is delivered. We actually had the crate specially designed. So one of the walls, the crate drops down into a ramp. The unit rolls out, you plug it in, it boots on, and we're ready to go. Training and onboarding, while it's a continual learning process, and that learning process is figuring out what your exact needs are, where it fits in your process line, and we help our clients with that. General training for function and usage can be accomplished in about an hour, 2 hours at the outside, oftentimes. And as far as maintenance goes, I feel we've used our COVID time very, very well. We were all locked in small rooms. Some of us were locked in a warehouse and kind of developing tech. So instead of having a system that needed to be serviced or had a lot of moving or intricate parts, we took that time to develop everything into sub-assemblies so that in the event that there was a maintenance issue, knowing that we couldn't go service a client, that we could send that unique sub-assembly for whatever that issue may be. And with nothing more than a screwdriver, any client could change it out. And that's a rarity. General maintenance and unit upkeep, other than just wiping it down and sanitization, is just changing out the generation element every 1,000 hours.
Do you monitor those sub-assemblies? Are the units connected so that way there's some sort of predictive or preventative maintenance so an assembly might be failing?
There is. So all of our units are fully IoT enabled. So you're able to interact with them via touchscreen panel on the units or via remote web connection, which gives you the full data log of what the unit's done from a minute by minute perspective, from an environmental standpoint, what it's done from an operational standpoint, who's used it, when it was open, when it was unlocked, kind of the full gamut suite there of data analytics. While it's very rare that we have a unit part go down, It does happen. I will say often it's the touchscreen because somebody bangs it hard and cracks it, or just something happens. Life happens to it. But really, outside of that, we do some hellacious stress tests to our units. I think we've got a few in the shop that have been running for a little over a year continuously, just waiting to see what breaks. It just hasn't yet. Not that it can't, not that it won't, not that things don't go wrong, because Murphy's Law does exist, but it's by no means a commonality.
What kind of ROI are operators looking at?
Near instantaneous. So the unit's got about a 30 to 50 pound capacity, depending on your biomass density. And if we take, let's put the value of cannabis, we'll take a market middle here, about $1,000 a pound. So if we're putting $1,000 a pound, we're putting 30 pounds in the unit. We'll take the low end of the average here for size. Now we've got $30,000 within the unit. At a $6,000 a month leasing fee, your ROI is already complete.
So is that how the business model works? Is the equipment leased, or is it something that they can buy outright?
So we started out doing outright sales. What we found is it really didn't give us the ability to support our clients the way we wanted to. Because these are oftentimes mission critical pieces of equipment that can't go down, we really want to be able to monitor them. We want to make sure they're up to date. Again, I mentioned the generation elements need changed out every 1,000 hours, and kind of all those little parts of, what if someone cracks the screen, or what if ... happens. We had an operator who had 3 units. The building was hit by lightning, blew out nearly every circuit in the building. Thankfully, all of our units have backup power supply and UPS systems, so we were able to avoid frying the units. But we had to go out there and replace a couple of fuses that did their job and took the brunt of that impact. But with just selling a unit, we were very much waiting for a client to call us with the problem. We wanted to be proactive about that. So while we do still offer unit sales occasionally on some older units, it's very rare that they come back from a lease, but occasionally they do. We'll refurb them in-house, full new electronics kits, full new suite of parts, and we'll put those out for sale. Mostly because they tend to have some cosmetic blemishes. They've lived in a warehouse in a production environment. They get dings, they get dents, they get scratches. So we will occasionally sell those and they come back, although it's fairly rare that they do. But that leasing structure really gave us the ability to infinitely supply clients with not only our time, but any parts that they may need, that in the event that one of our technicians or I have to fly out somewhere to assist somebody with any type of problem, that's already accounted for. And again, we really like to be that hands-on approach. So it, for us, was the better fit. And what we've kind of found is that hybrid between primarily leasing, but yeah, we will occasionally sell. We've got some European partners, some South American partners who, because it's much more difficult for us to support them to that leasing model, that we've been very upfront with them that, like, hey, it would actually be better for you guys to buy outright, amortize the unit, actually do your depreciation, because unlike the US, they have a little bit better tax structures there around cannabis due to a federal legality on their level. So, hey, this actually works out a little bit better for you. And as part of that, let's go ahead and build into this price. We'll call it 2 years of generation elements based on your projected throughput and usage. And if we want to set aside, some room in the budget for any maintenance or tech staff, we could do that there. But really giving our clients that a la carte choice.
What is the footprint?
So its footprint's about the size of an older refrigerator, about 5.5 feet tall, 2.5 feet deep, 3 feet wide, rolls on caster wheels, fits through every standard door frame, plugs into a 110 outlet, pulls about 4.5 amps at max draw. Incredibly power efficient, incredibly space efficient. Having come from a deep cultivation background and knowing that every square foot and every cultivation I've ever been a part of is used twice, if not thrice over, it was important that this thing fit anywhere, move anywhere, and could get through a door.
It seems like you're really involved with the ongoing R&D with the product. How do you reconcile that with yourself? Well, I guess the leasing model kind of lends itself to that, where if you want to roll out new features, you can kind of do it across the fleet.
Very much so. So we've got a new GMP compliant reporting system that we have for our software set, so that when clients need that level of GMP reporting, to say, okay, at the end of a completed cycle, this is who ran it, this was the time, this was the exact cycle, this was the reason why, and it issues that report, we can load that software out. It also gives our team the ability to develop that. A lot of our updates, a lot of our functionality changes are user driven. Great example, the generation alpha of the unit, oh man, so long ago, had a thumbprint scanner for the lock. well, I don't know if you've ever been in cultivation, but nearly everybody wears gloves and nearly every glove is covered in hash or resin. So that was a failure point that we had to move around. So we kind of moved past that. But as we kind of developed, as we've worked through kind of that initial set of clients in the last several years, we've really kind of taken all of that feedback into account, and we still continue to do so. It's rare that we make a hardware change at this point, having gone through our CE validations. Occasionally we will. We tend to use top-end parts for everything. The fans that are part of the system are an IP68 fully frameless, fully encapsulated fan. They'll essentially never die, and cleaning them is as easy as dunking them in a bucket of isopropyl alcohol. We've tried to make things as robust and bulletproof as they can, although sometimes things go wrong. We had a client who had a pipe burst in their facility over a weekend. They came back to 4 feet of water through the entire building. Fortunately, our electronics bay is in the top of our unit, so all that got soaked was a little bit of wiring. We have a full hermetic seal around everything, so we were fine there, but a lot of other things got sabotaged. Again, the lightning strike. We had a client accidentally run into one with a forklift once and skewer it. Unfortunately, there's no way to fix that. And, again, the leasing model, though, allows us to completely replace that unit.
So looking at the industry in general, what's your outlook? What are your expectations for, let's just say, the next year and then maybe your 5-year outlook?
Outlook for the industry or outlook for UFOMO itself?
For the industry.
Outlook for the industry. I think that we're going to see, hopefully, a unification, like we said, from some regulatory compliance standards. There's already a lot of work to that regard being done. There's a lot of activist groups throughout the country. There's a lot of organizations, the ASTM is one of them, PharmacoPia is another, that are really looking to develop and foster that thought leadership. One of the cool things I think that we'll really see is that push towards nutraceutical and individualized medicine, kind of bringing cannabis back from near a pure recreational product to kind of a medicinal product. I think that's something that's really fallen by the wayside to a degree in a lot of places, where we are now looking more at the distribution and sale of a commodity than we are maybe for a medicinal benefit. And I think that a lot of the research that's being done on collegiate and scientific levels will really come to bear in that time, and that will allow us to take that jump forward.
So what are your expectations for Yofumo?
Hopefully in every country that sells and produces cannabis. And that's the goal.
Well, Joseph, I really appreciate you taking the time, man. But before we get out of here, I always like to ask, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or your work at Yofumo?
I would say there's one other thing I would like them to know about Yofumo in general. We mentioned that decontamination is that first step to that post-harvest line. And as part of that, one of the things that we wanted our system to do was be a little bit more than that first step. So while our machines do foster decontamination, we think they do a very good job of it. One of the other things they do is foster curation, biosynthesis, which is a very environmentally driven chemical reaction. We're looking at enzyme reactions, we're looking at respiration. And because we have the ability to minutely and granularly control temperature and humidity, we're able to foster that reaction much more efficiently through our unit than a lot of traditional methodologies such as bags, buckets, or burping systems, so that we can not necessarily provide a one-stop shop, but provide a system and platform that, again, helps foster that consistency. If there was kind of one takeaway, it would be that we're far more than just a decontamination company.
Well, Joseph, thank you again for taking the time. I really do appreciate it, and I hope we get a chance to do it again soon.
I would absolutely love to. It's been a great time, and thank you again for having me. This has been wonderful.
Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Joseph Edwards, Chief Science Officer at Yofumo Technologies, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.